Welcome! Today we start with a new series here on YouTube that will revolve completely around exposure therapy. My goal is to make around 5 or 6 videos of around 20 minutes where we discuss everything about exposure therapy to enhance your practice. So we're going to talk about target selection, about how to set up a basic exposure. We're going to talk about easy metaphors that you can use with your clients. We're going to talk about all kind of inspiration so that you feel inspired or creative to build up your exposure list. And before we're going to do that, I find it important to refer like the literature that I use for these videos so that you actually know where I get the information from, that you can read or dive into it if you want it. So I find this book is very important, but also these articles. And just see what fits you if you want to dive into these topics. Like my idea is with this channel mostly that it can fit besides reading books or besides having official training to just learn new things in a different way by using modern media. And today we're going to talk everything about target selection. And short theoretical background is to freshen up the memory of how does exposure therapy actually work? So there are several concepts that are easy to remember when you think about how this actually works. And those are around safety learning, around inhibitory learning, and memory retrieval and the hierarchy within that. In the base, safety learning means that the goal with exposure therapy is to expose your clients to these stimuli that are now linked to unsafety and actually build up networks in the brain that link them to safety. So for example, you have a client that comes in with more panic attack symptoms and panic disorder symptoms. And they say, yeah, I don't want to go to the supermarket. And you ask why? The supermarket, I will get a panic attack there. And even thinking about it gives me anxiety. So the supermarket is actually normally kind of an unconditioned stimuli, right? Like most people don't feel a lot of anxiety going there. But for the client, it is linked to the panic attack and they also expect it to happen. What you actually want to do in exposure therapy is you want to expose the clients to the supermarket and build up a new meaning. Like, I didn't get a panic attack. That is most likely that will happen within the exposure therapy. But even if in the small chance that a client gets a panic attack, that's still okay. If they learn that they can manage it, then we still have a successful exposure. So we can still build up that safety network. So that safety network is really about clients also learning that the likelihood of what they expect to happen is very small, but also that if it happens, they have much more coping skills to actually deal with it, or that they can actually tolerate the fear that it evoked. So you want to not do this once, you want to do this in several situations, in several supermarkets, around several times to really build up that network. Another example is we often see clients with more social anxiety. And that can look something like vocalizing my opinion, which is a bit anxiety provoking for people, but a lot of people can also do this in relatively easy ways in most situations. But if a client feels like, hey, vocalizing my opinion will lead to rejection and that evokes anxiety, that's like an unsafe pathway in the brain. You actually want to expose a client by asking them to vocalize their opinion in exposures to create a new pathway where they find out, hey, I didn't get rejected. And maybe even I feel much more connected to other people, or I can finally talk about the subjects that I actually love, or I feel much more like myself. I am now authentically in connection with another person. That's just all building up that safety network. So that is safety learning. And we know that if we make that safety network as strong and large and vast as possible, is that because we have inhibitory learning, is that in the base, it means that when your brain tries to picks actually the memory that will be retrieved, it will automatically pick the network that is strongest or largest. And if we make the safety network the strongest or the largest, it will automatically inhibit the unsafety one and it will automatically be retrieved. And that actually means that your client will say something like, hey, I barely feel anxiety or no anxiety at all anymore when I go to the supermarket. Or hey, I'm actually enjoying myself now I'm speaking up. So that is actually the theoretical background of exposure therapy and its working mechanisms. So if we know that our job is to find the right exposure targets, because you can do exposure on all kinds of things, but you actually want to take those that are now linked to the largest or strongest unsafety network, or that it is the ask for help by the client. They might have something else going on that provokes much more anxiety, but they actually want to be helped with this part, and you start with that. Okay, so how do we start? How do we actually build up those exposures? There are actually 3 ways to do this, and that's what we're going to discuss in this video. So the first one is actually, I think a very known one, is to use the official mental health diagnosis, find the protocol that is made for it, and execute the protocol. And it depends on your registration or your license if you're actually allowed to diagnose a client formally. You might work with a larger team. You might work in a specialized mental health facility where, regardless of your license, multiple professionals are seeing the client in those first conversations. And the idea is that at the end of the intake phase, you have a mental health diagnosis. Sometimes you have several, but then you pick the most primary one, or the one that feels like doing the client's ask for help most justice. But you actually pick one, you find the protocol, and you execute it. And for example, in the Netherlands, we have these large books with all the protocols. I have several one printed out. And this is the one for social anxiety, and it literally writes for each session what you need to do. And it also describes the theoretical background. And I think it is in the 3rd session here that you start with the exposure by doing presentations within the session. So that is how the social anxiety protocol starts in the Netherlands. You actually execute this protocol, and at the end, you evaluate again how it is with the symptoms. And in this protocol, there are often examples of exposures, or they are literally written out for you. There are pros and cons to this approach. I think a big pro is that it is actually rooted in scientific research. So these are often the ones that are also used within randomized control trials. They have a clear structure. I think they are ideally if you are starting as a therapist, because you can actually build up your expertise and practice by using them. I also think that a big pro of this is that it is less prone to therapy drift. So if you follow the protocol, you have a very clear focus. The cons to this approach are that it is not so flexible, and that if a client doesn't completely fit in these protocols, you might feel stuck with the protocols because you don't know really how to tweak them or how to move with them in a flexible way. Another problem with this can be when there is comorbidity, or there is a variety of asks for help from the clients. But in the base, great way to get started. Here you can see some examples of different protocols and how they choose the target exposure selection within that. So pause it if you want to read more of that. The second one is to actually build up an anxiety trigger list, a list of all the conditioned stimuli. This is the strategy that I use most often, but you can of course search what fits you and your clients the best. This is actually very intuitive in a way that you just ask what kind of targets or situations evoke your anxiety. And you can ask that in general, but often you might tweak it towards the mental health issues your client came to you with. For example, okay, in what kind of situations evoke that social anxiety, or what kind of situations evoke that fear of getting another panic attack. So you can use it in a broad way, you can use it in a more focused way, and I think it is important to ask your clients locations, people. So sometimes it is not like all people, but dominant people or people who are very have a very loud voice. You can also ask them towards objects, specific emotions, specific internal situations like memories or interoceptive stimuli, so that you really build up that conditioned stimuli list. And after that, you have this whole list, and you can just start with it by asking your clients to expose themselves to one or multiple of these targets. Another way of doing this is to actually see if there is like certain groups within the targets, and you can label them as a group. For example, taking up space can be a group. And afterwards, you can just say to your clients, I want you to do 2 exposures this week where you take up space. So I find this, I really like this strategy. It's also a strategy that I have been trained in when I was starting. And that was because I was working with more complex anxiety issues. And that also meant that we barely had, like, I would say, a clean mental health diagnosis where you could just follow a protocol. Often there were like a group of social anxiety triggers, a group of bodily sensation triggers. Sometimes there were OCD triggers or trauma-related triggers. And then you have this whole spectrum of anxiety triggers. And I feel like this approach really helped to kind of organize that and build up an exposure treatment where clients also could follow along what they were doing. And one of the things that I used to do back then, and still sometimes do it, is one of the ways to enhance your exposure practice is to build in the component of surprise, because that often evokes that anxiety network, which enhance the safety learning. And one of the ways to do that is that we would just write down different categories. We would crumble them up, put them in a jar, and each time a client would pick one, and then we would do exposure together in the session. Or we would say, okay, you come up with a homework assignment and I come up with a homework assignment. And both of them were exposures that were around this target. So that also kept the part of surprise in it. And I felt that it would also kind of bring some humor in it. And clients often also become a bit playful with it. Because this can actually be quite hard for clients to do, all these difficult exposures. And here you can actually see an example. So what you see in this example is that it is focused around social anxiety triggers, but it also has to do with physical intimacy, with sexual intimacy. There's also kind of an emotional fear, that they fear the emotion itself. There is fear for fear. And I think by doing it like this, you can actually still build up a clear exposure treatment without using the protocols, but you are using the same mechanisms behind this. Also in this book, they talk a lot about this approach. So that might also be a great read if you want to learn more about this. And there are different pros and cons to this approach as well. The first pro is that it is flexible, which I also named, is that makes it kind of easy to use with more complex anxiety issues or when there are diffuse anxiety symptoms, so that it is kind of across the board. I also really like that it is more playful and that you can kind of easily build in that effect of surprise, which again can enhance the safety learning. It is often an easy way for clients to follow, because they come for a client. Clients don't think in mental health diagnosis often. They just have these symptoms. And by doing it like this, they can often easily follow along, and they actually feel seen and heard in all of their anxiety issues, and not only a small group of them. And a thing that I really like about this approach is that it actually teaches you as a therapist the mechanisms of anxiety treatment And you don't have to learn it for each separate diagnosis. I really like the metaphor of going to make an ice cream. If you know how to make chocolate ice cream, you can easily make stracciatella ice cream. And that is also with exposure therapy. If you understand the rationale, the working mechanisms behind it, it becomes much easier also for clients. The cons of this approach is the very first big con is therapy drift. That you need to really understand what you're doing before you are going to do all these exposures that are not really the most effective way of helping your client. And especially if there is a time limit or there is a session limit because of the health insurance, because of the financial situation of your client, then it might be really good to think if this is the right approach, because then might be a very focused or a part of the protocol might be better suited. And there is less clear amount of structure, but you can do that yourself with your clients, that you say, hey, we're going to do this for 12 sessions. After 6 sessions, we will evaluate, or we do 18 sessions. But at the start, talk about it with your clients. So that is actually the second approach. And the third way is to make an exposure list. I think this is a very common one and used by therapists. And it is actually you build up a list and you actually write down what the actual exposure already is. So for example, going to the supermarket, running in my place for 3 minutes, vocalizing my opinion in a work meeting. It is different from the second one because then we talk about the conditioned stimuli. So that would be vocalizing my opinion. That is quite similar, but that would be much more like having a fast heartbeat. An actual exposure list can be helpful because it is also easy to follow for clients. You ask them often like, hey, what do you want to achieve in this treatment? Or last session, what do you want to be able to do then that you can't do now? For example, they say, hey, I want to be able to speak up in a work meeting. You write that one down. Then you ask them, hey, what else do you want to do? You write those down as well. And from there on, you kind of ask them, okay, if that is a 60 on the scale of anxiety from 0 to 100, what kind of exposure would provoke an 80 or 100 or a 20 or a 30? And by that, you build up several exposures with different kind of anxiety levels. A very important thing to mention, however, with this approach is that the anxiety hierarchy approach is one that has been taught like mostly in the 80s, 90s. But by now we know with the current scientific knowledge that we have is that that is actually not a great way to do exposure. So it is okay to create an exposure list. However, don't build it up in a clear hierarchy. So don't do that. And why it is that doing it in a context where you actually build it up can become a safety behavior, because it can actually give the message to your clients that, hey, anxiety is indeed something to be afraid of and you have to build it up slowly. And by that, clients might learn that, hey, the next time I fear something, I have to take it in very small steps. And I think this is very a negotiating part between you don't want to scare your clients away by immediately asking them to do kind of a super exposure with 80 or 90 or 100. On the other hand, we also know that it is important for safety learning that there is actually a gap, that it is not slowly built up. So you can also explain that to your clients, and that might motivate them to immediately start doing something with a 70 and then a 30 and then a 80. But still building up an exposure list can be an easy way to do that. And I would say keep it around 10 to 15 exposures, and you can do them within the treatment sessions, or you give them as homework, like I want you to do 2 or 3 of them between our sessions. And here you can see an example of an exposure list. And I think this is a great strategy as well. The pros of this approach is that firstly, this is very clear to clients, and it is often also the language of a client. A client doesn't really come to you with like, okay, sometimes they do like, hey, these are all my targets. These are all my conditioned stimuli. Often they come with an ask for help. Hey, I want to be able to be intimate with my boyfriend again. Or hey, I actually want to be able to do my thesis presentation, or hey, I actually want to take a flight to Japan. So it is often a very client-friendly way of doing it. Also, it is, I would say, time-saving, because at the start you actually already built the list. So within those sessions, you have time to talk about other things or to tweak the exposures. I think a con of this list is that when it is used with a clear hierarchy, this can actually hinder the build-up of the safety network. So again, it is very good to use this practice. However, don't do it in a clear hierarchy. Another one is that it can also be quite boring or predictable, because a client already knows what they are going to do. And again, for safety learning, it can really be helpful if there is an element of surprise. And I think the last one is that what I've also experienced myself in practice is that, especially if clients come at the start of therapy and there is not a lot of motivation, or there is very much resistance toward exposure therapy, or they are really afraid of doing it, is that it is for clients often very hard to come up with these examples, because they can't even comprehend that they might be able to do these things. So yeah, that's a con as well. I think in general, all these strategies are okay. And of course, I think as a scientific practitioners that we are all trained in, the protocols have a certain pro. I often use the second strategy, and you also have the third one that is often used by therapists. Here you can actually see a clear overview of the pros and cons of each method. You can pause it. I think the take-home message of this is that there are various ways of choosing your targets for exposure therapy. And the most important thing is that you choose the exposures that actually build up that safety network as fast, as large, and as strong as possible. And whatever strategy you choose, be also kind to yourself, especially if you're starting with this, and ask for good supervision. And if you have any questions or you want to exchange some experiences, just drop them in the comment section. I really feel happy if you have seen this video, so thank you for that, and have a great day. Bye! Thank you so much for watching this video. This is a quick reminder that on my website you can find free therapy forms for all kinds of modalities. They are easy to download in PDF. In Word, they don't have a specialized tag on it, so you can easily use them and also custom them for your clients. When we are talking about exposure, you can find all these forms on there, both in English and Dutch. And for, I would say, all kinds of anxiety issues, we have the generalized case conceptualization, which is a very easy way of starting your exposure trajectory. Then we have the standard exposure form. There is exposure information that you can just give to your client, which explains exposure therapy based on the current scientific research. And there is an fill-in form about safety behaviors. Then we have more forms specialized for certain specific anxiety issues. For interoceptive exposure, there is an instruction for clients and there is an instruction for therapists. There is a social exposure list with all kind of inspiration. And then there is a whole part for OCD. This is also something, a way of therapy that I really enjoy. So there is a bit more for OCD besides the case conceptualization specified for OCD, the exposure with response prevention form. There's also the OCD cycle visual, the common thinking patterns in OCD, and there is an inspiration form for ERP for therapists. So make sure to check it out. And if you're still here, it would be lovely if you could click the subscribe button or interact with the video, because that will help me also. And thank you so much for being here, and hope you have a great day. Bye!